Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Life Burst podcast. I'm Andrew, and today we're going to start talking about the Prismatic Diva Set 10 tier list. If you're new to Wixoss, this is a great place to jump in and learn a little bit about what the most powerful decks are, what you can kind of choose from. And if you're looking for any of these decks, at least anything from tier A to tier B here, you'll want to go to my Dexus link in the information down below. That'll give you basically all of the decks that I've worked on for a while. Anything that you see set 10 here in the numbers is basically something that I've done. I don't do all of them. I just do, I think, the tier A and what I think is tier A and tier B, but you can always find other examples of things down below. Let's jump right into it. At the very top end, we have Deus as the top end of A tier. I do not know whether Deus, Atomic Deus, and Remember, this is the Esper Remember, which one is actually better than each other, but I am going to just tarry on being careful here and just conservative and say that Remember is maybe worse than Atomic Deus. Really, I don't know if that's true or not. They're both very, very strong. Atomic Deus won the most recent GP, so let's just go ahead and say Deus for now. Atomic Deus is a mid-range deck using the Atomic formula, the Atomic Signies, to open up lanes and deal lots of damage while also stripping cards with discard as well, and just being hard to deal with Signy. Remember comes in and is this Esper control. Now, a lot of you guys have actually asked, what is Esper? Esper control is white, blue, black, some kind of makeup of those. There's just a lot of tools in those types of decks to make a control deck really function well. It discards out the opponent, strips them of resources, enter starves them, and then also shuts down lanes that are open, so that way you don't take very much damage, and also maintains a clock. What makes Remember sort of take this over Madoka here, or Tama, which were the basically Esper control Elrigs of choice, is that Remember just allows you to have unparalleled filtering, which means that your deck is more of a toolbox than ever, which means that it can find all the answers it needs to answer the questions asked by other sort of decks that are throwing out threats. And just answers them pretty well. So I think it is probably one of the top decks that you can choose. Tama White Aggro. This is white, probably white-black at this point. It's got the mill function to it. But it's mostly this mono-white aggro deck. I still think it's very, very, very strong. In fact, I've actually seen a lot of the stuff that Starfruit, when he got 4th place at the GP, his deck sort of has been echoing into the Japanese meta right now, and a lot of these sort of mono-white decks that have been using Umir Clear have been showing up and actually doing pretty well, even in the very powerful Japanese meta that's like 1 year ahead of ours. So I still think this is actually very, very strong. Together, these 3 decks, in my opinion, are probably the top of Wixoss, and basically are maybe even somewhat of a rock, paper, scissors amongst each other. And I think these are sort of the decks to utilize if you're going to try to do something and like win big tournaments or something. Coming down right below that, I've got Madoka 2. This is the Esper Elrig Lock deck. I say Elrig Lock because it's got the ability to shut down other opposing control decks. I don't actually know if this is better than Remember overall, but it seems like it might have a good Remember matchup, just changing that sort of like Elrig damage math. And that's one of the reasons why Madoka was just sort of the best control centers in set 9, in my opinion. So it's fallen a little bit just because Remember exists now, and also I do kind of like white a little bit more as a control main color than Madoka, which is blue. Although there's arguments to be said, things like, being able to run more ZRs is pretty good. So I still am keeping this in the A tier, even though maybe it is just top of B tier. Right below that, I've put down X and Deus as an aggro deck. both of these sort of Team DXM still both really run very similarly and also are still quite good for what it's worth. If you've never played the DXM deck, what they do is they're really resistant to what the opponent's trying to do. They just have a lot of ways to like just ignore what the opponent's trying to stop their damage output with, and they have a lot of ways to bring stuff back from the trash and toolbox with Enter Burn and things like that. So X Deus as Team DXM, still pretty good, but a really difficult deck. You can't just kind of blindly run it, and even Tama a little bit here, you can kind of run a little bit easier because you're just kind of white aggro and just punching. X you need to think about, it's not quite as easy to run as white aggro. So I think it's still a very, very good deck if you want something that's a top tier. It just requires a lot of like playing the deck and understanding its in and outs. Dropping down to B tier, I've put down Tama, Discard Control. This is that Esper Tama I was talking about earlier. I took it to top 8. It's still a very strong deck. I actually still think, you can make arguments to say Madoka's better than Remember. You can make arguments to say that Tama's better than Remember for the same deck. But your argument for that would be like, well, Tama has a built-in clock, and thus it can't, some aggro decks could maybe beat Remember if they've got the right draws, whereas Tama basically will always say no, and then will go ahead and stop damage. And then just attack force with extra damage, so it's pretty good. With that in mind, moving down to B tier, we've got Dash Hirana. This is this stereotypical aggro deck. It's just really hyper aggro. It'll still get a job done. I think if you're going to a locals, a 3-rounder, 4-rounder with like very little top, maybe no cut to top 8 or top 4, whatever it is that your locals are doing, Hirana's pretty primed to just take out an unexpected grouping. If, for example, Remember, you start seeing a lot of Atomic Deuses and Remembers in your play groups, and they are sort of like metagaming against each other to have the better long game, well then an unprepped stuff like that, Hirana can be the boogeyman and just come in there and wreck them and win turn 3 games. I think this is still a very strong deck, but it's just unstable, which is why it ends up in B tier. Mel gets my vote for being just a little bit below that Dash. It's lacking in as much power as Hirana has, but the upside is it's got super stability. So Mel's accessories that they get with being a green-black deck is just this sort of like, it's just really, really hard to hate it out of whatever it's doing. It's just constantly doing the same thing, which is like good stuff, dealing some damage, drawing extra cards, making sure they have Enter, taking that Enter sinks to do more effects than you expect in a normal game of Wixoss. I think it's still a very, very strong choice. It's the best green deck that you can possibly play at this point in time. Something that I've done here is I've actually moved Carnival up in my picking order. So a lot of people are playing, there's about 2 different ways to play it. You can either play this like red-black deck that is more aggressive, or you can play a red-white-blue deck, America. And it's more Enter denial, hate on the opponent. You're doing a lot of the stuff where you're trashing a lot of the opponent's signies. And you're doing some amount of discard as well. That's my preferred path for it, but the aggro path is also perfectly acceptable. Either way, it's actually very, very strong. It might get a little less strong now that Remember is in the meta, because Remember can actually kind of, like, it's once per game, kind of just screws Carnival pretty hard. But I actually think you have to be a really smart player in order to run Carnival correctly, especially the more like American colored ones. But if you do, it can actually really reward tight technical play. Right below that is Aya. This is that stereotypical hyper discard attack with bottoming things down to the bottom of the opponent's deck and attack through with lanes to give out very little enter. Aya has not really gained anything new that's making it really strong or anything. But it also doesn't really need to. It was a strong deck on its own. It was at the top of B tier. I think it's the middle of B tier now because it didn't really gain anything. But it's still a very good deck to do. When your opponents know how to play against it, it can be countered. But if you don't really know how to play against Aya, you can wipe people pretty easily with it. Like it feels very rude to play against because it just does a lot of mean things. The interesting thing here is Umir, the Death and Taxes build, which I should clarify here is now 3 colors. Boop. Is over in it jumped from being like C tier, almost getting into D tier territory to B tier here. It picked up a lot of cards that is really, really good. If you guys want to get a check of this deck, you can go ahead and check my deck out. It played a lot similarly to Aya, just way worse enter-wise. But with the new cards that have come through and really made it much stronger overall, that being Mayu and, or Mew, I guess is how it's pronounced, and Musica, the Memoria, it plays not like a tempo deck anymore. It plays like a true Death and Taxes, almost like a stacks deck, where it just goes really, really long game and just drains your opponent's resources, and over a really long game will just crush them. It has some trouble against aggro, but it crushes control decks, and that's really where it's starting to shine. So if you want something that's very attrition-based, and it's like, this could go to turn, 15, and if it does, I'm very likely to win. Umir, the new version, is actually quite good, so go check that deck out. Below that, Tamago. I've dropped off Tamago. It's almost like it's getting to C tier now. There's so many different Esper decks that can be done. Tamago, its freeze thing is also getting a little pulled out on by Remember, because Remember can also freeze things now. And in less awkward colors, I guess, too, because freeze ends up being a white-blue thing generally, because it's trying to resource deny, and those colors are better at resource denying overall than like blue-black, which Tamago generally finds itself in because it doesn't really have a way to deal damage. This is why Tamago has sort of fallen down in favor. I still think it's a perfectly fine deck to run, but it's starting to become more average than, above average. Yuziki Enterburn, I think this is actually, the version that I've got out is this more mono white version which is mostly Enter Denial with a light Enterburn package. I actually think this one is actually quite strong and quite good. So I would check that out as well. It is, if you want something that's like, it's like basically almost like a mono red deck from Magic the Gathering. Yuzuki is the closest that you're going to get. I think it's quite strong. I really like it. Its third color is up for debate. If I had to say a third color, it would either be another white center or white assist. Probably black. Urith is a really good choice nowadays. It really hasn't gained too many tools, but also didn't lose any tools in comparison to everyone else gaining tools. So it's still a very strong option that you can do if you want just like some red aggro that's a little bit more straightforward. Gazuko is, and I spelled that wrong, I realize now. Oop, fixed. Gazuko is mostly a black aggro deck. And it has this sort of like combo-esque finisher where it can really wipe the board for very little enter. It plays a lot like an X or Deus deck, just with a little bit less toolboxing and a little bit more aggression in it. I think it's a perfectly valid choice to play. Bottom of B tier, just because X and Deus maybe play the deck a little similar, or maybe even a little better. But it has a bit more of an aggression, which gives it a little bit more of a niche to work with. So I like that Gozuko deck. And then at the bottom of B tier, I've placed Midori Rico. This is an interesting one. I don't know if it stays here in B tier or it dips to mid C tier, or maybe it goes up a little bit in B tier. It's worth testing because it does have, it's the first deck that I can pretty confidently say is a green aggro deck. Pretty much with every other green deck I've wanted to be more of a mid-range attrition-esque deck. This is the first one that has the tools built into its center Elrig, mostly that enter burn and that board wipe, where I want it to be more aggro in approach or aggressive in approach. So I like the idea of it. The problem is that everything it does is a little clunky, so in theory crafting it should be pretty good, but you'll have to wait for the next tiering update to see if it lands up or it lands down, depending. But I'm excited to test it and play it a little bit, right? Dropping down to C tier, this is sort of like where my cutoff of like really good decks versus like the decks that are now pretty average or below average. I've dropped Lion down here, which is sad, but the truth is Lion's Endless Punchline is really the reason why you would run it. It's this combo deck that filters through all of its stuff and tries to basically get this really, really, really strong Endless Punchline to be 3 damage in 1 turn from an Elrig attack. While it was really good early on, and it still is good at what it does, which is tax guards to no end, and then also punch a bunch with the Elrig attack. It's still very strong, but it's lacking a little bit in its second approach, right? While you're filtering and then doing this Endless Punchline, you're not ending the game with the Endless Punchline anymore because the aggro tools that it had before are just distinctly lacking now, and the Endless Punchline does not win the game on its own. It deals 3 damage, which is a lot, but not enough to end the game. It really needs more aggro tools to bring it back up. If it got those aggro tools, I think Lion probably could punch back up to B tier, maybe even A tier in the Desona meta in about a year from now. But currently, it's not really pulling its weight. The next thing here is Eldoria and Miko Miko. The really big thing about this is it's an atomic deck, so it's a lot like the Deus atomic deck. But it is Eldoria or Miko Miko basically as the center. Both of them are more or less the same deck. This actually went up in estimation from D tier to C tier, and it's mostly because of how much usage there was of this in the GP, which means that, just pure representation has brought it floated up a little bit, so you should be aware that it exists, and it's a thing people are using, especially because I guess they like those 2 Elrigs. And the atomic deck itself is just strong enough that it's good and powerful on its own, even if Eldoria and Miko Miko aren't the best centers to use with it. But I think it is a good deck. So if you want to play Atomic and not play those, you could play it with these 2 centers and be perfectly fine. My favorite deck of choice, which is the Bang, the second Bang deck, Bang 2.0, who's my favorite Elrig, is still fine. It's still fine in C tier. It basically does everything that Mel does, just slightly worse. The only difference is Mel has a hard time getting Enter, so you need to pack Enter into the main deck, whereas Bang has it naturally built into the Elrig deck. That's not a bad thing though, because a lot of the green cards are only good because they can Enter charge. So doing other things with your center, which is what Mel does, and then relying on your main deck to Enter charge you is actually perfectly fine. So that's one of the reasons why Mel just does everything that it does better, so it's up there higher in usage. But it's still a fine deck, and I'm still going to keep playing it for a while because it's my pet deck. The interesting newcomer, and I've actually been playing this quite a bit, is Milalune as a Spellslinger deck. There's a specific type of build that I've got, and again, you can check out my decks if you want to sneak peek, but I'll be talking about it more in the new centers that I'm going to be revealing on this channel a little later down the line. Milalune is a Spellslinger's deck. Very different in Wixoss than feel as a play feel than any of the other decks that I've ever played as, because you're just like this spell, this spell, this spell, and do removal, and I'm attacking all the way through. It's actually quite aggressive, way more aggressive than I thought. So I have this build, and it was lightly based off of some Japanese builds that I found, and I sort of like just tested out things, changed some things. It ended up being way more aggressive than I thought. Like, I was almost opening 3 lanes from turn 2 to turn 4, and then turn 4 to turn 6, I was opening up at least 2 lanes with it. And I think it might be soft to some control decks, maybe some discard stuff. But it really utilizes the stuff that it's given very well. I think there's some potential here to maybe pop it up to maybe bottom of B tier, if it gets perfected enough. But it is very interesting, very different than anything else in Wixoss. So it's something probably you should prep against if you're going to gauntlet things and understand how some stuff is going. Then there's Nova. This is the normal stall control deck. It actually just got a new tool in, I think, Afternoon Tea, which is quite strong. This is sort of your classic, whereas all these other control decks have maybe evolved a little bit to be more nuanced and unique. Nova just puts up walls and says, don't mess with me. It barely discards anything. It just really stalls by walling out the field. If you're playing a bunch of aggro decks in your meta, Nova will kill them all by doing this. But it struggles with some other types of control decks and some mid-range decks. But it's still a strong deck that you could be playing. With the new tool of Afternoon Tea, I think it's actually still a perfectly fine option. Akino just got a new tool. Akino 2.0 got a new tool to make it pretty good. I think it's Siren is what its name is in this new set. It's just a different version of Tama aggro, Tama white aggro that you could run. I think it's fine and strong. I don't know if it's as good since Tama just gives you a more reliable source of damage, but it's similar. So if you want something interesting, I also have that on my list as something that you can check out, my decks' options. It's just an interesting deck that I think exists in the meta now that didn't quite exist before. And then moving into D tier, we've got Iona, and I'm just going to briefly talk about this. Iona midrange, it's still doing its thing. Nothing's really changed about it. Yuka control. I think it's probably maybe not as green as it was before, so it ends up just being blue and white. And there's a fair amount of usage for it, so it still exists. I think it does the Esper thing the worst out of all these other decks, but it's still a perfectly fine choice to do if you like taxing things. You've got Musica, Cosmos Aggro. Cosmos Aggro got a few more new tools in it. That's pretty good, but overall, it's still dropping in terms of what it was dropping before. It doesn't really do anything nuanced. It just opens up lanes and sort of crosses its fingers and hopes. Maho Control or Stacks is this sort of long game attrition deck that you could be running. Perfectly fine choice if you want to. Nothing's really changed about it. Senga, which feels like the longest holdout forever. It's just like, it's this third green deck that exists and is like, look, I'm just here, I'm doing my rainbow thing, I enter, I draw cards, I'm not a terrible option, I'm not great either, but it's still holding on strong to what it does, so, I still think it's perfectly fine choice. Has dropped off. It probably should be just completely removed at this point. The main reason I haven't is I'm still testing out Midori Rico. But it feels like it does everything that Ott does better, but World's Reverse is still a really good draw to this deck, so it still has kind of a niche there. And then Paraluke, discard midrange. Again, I just think there's so many other midrange decks that do the job better, especially at atomic stuff. And then there's some, like if you were to go to more of a control route, there's a lot of different control decks that sort of do the same thing better. It's just not quite there. Don't worry, in Desona world, Paraluke will become very, very strong. So you've got something to look forward to. And then, for what it's worth here, just to jump in here, I don't know if you guys are following my cube, but these are the things that I've added to the set here to replace out in the cube beforehand. You guys can just pause it and look at what I've got here. So yeah, if you guys are looking for cube stuff, here's some extra information for cube. All right, guys, that's it. If you want to check out these decks, we're going to have the new centers coming out very shortly.